creativity. What are ways to overcome creative block in times when motivation to anything is minimal? It's really common. And then I have a problem with consistency. I love starting projects, and for a little while, everything flows nicely. Then suddenly, I become apathetic towards an idea that I thought I loved and never touch again. What are good ways to keep going after you start something? Okay, these are both really good questions. Let's kind of take the creative block one, when motivation to do anything is minimal. So motivation and creative block, I kind of think are two different things, but I'm going to sort of pick them apart a little bit. My view of creative block is always the same, that you're at the beginning of a project and you almost always see the end in mind, and you have a theory about what the end should be, a really concrete one. So the easiest way, I think, to get creative block is to say I have to do something good. That's the easiest way. Because then, right at the beginning, when you should be doing lots of things that are bad, you've already stopped yourself because you're being concerned about doing something good. You're attached to an outcome that makes you filter rather than figure out, what is every way I could do this project? How could I start this project now? How could I start it quickly? How could I do multiple versions? Instead, it's, how can I do something good? And for whatever reason, when people want to do something good, they never think of, let me do all the bad things first and get them out of the way so that when I do the good thing, I'll know what it is. Another one is I have to do something innovative, I have to do something cool, I have to do something impressive, rather than I need to make a painting, or I need to design a poster, or I need to, something absurd, make an app is not absurd. I was gonna say design a car, but whatever. But the more that you're attached to that end in a qualitative way, if the judgment is I need to design a car that fits 4 people, that should help you, because now you know where to start. You actually know where to start. What kind of things fit 4 people in them? But if the thing is, I have to design the best-selling car in the world, I'm not convinced that you could do that. No matter how skilled you are, unless you had years to do tons of bad work, I think that stops you in your tracks and makes you do shitty work. I was just talking about Quentin Tarantino and how he always talks about all these sequels he's gonna make, and he never makes any of these sequels, even though he'll be like, it's 40% written, such and such is gonna be in this one. Like, he always talks about these sequels and prequels that don't happen. I just saw an article from 2009 or 10 or something, where he was talking about the prequel to, what's the Nazi hunting movie?
Inglourious Basterds.
He's talking about the prequel to Inglourious Basterds. And he's like, yeah, it's 40% written. And you're reading it, and you're like, that kind of sounds like Django Unchained, which is very clearly not a prequel to Inglourious Basterds. It's just a movie that takes place in a different period of time than the other one that's earlier. But it's not a prequel in any way, shape, or form. But he says in this interview, it's 40% written. And it's about black soldiers behind enemy lines during the Civil War. What that sounds like to me is, I started writing this thing, and at some point I realized that instead of writing the thing I meant to write, I'm going in this new direction. He does that with every single movie. The Kill Bill sequels won't ever happen, because he doesn't work like that. I think he starts out with a preconceived notion, Kill Bill sequel, and then somehow that turns into Inglourious Basterds. Inglourious Basterds prequel, somehow that turns into something else. So, if he tried to struggle through the end, I think what we would get from Quentin Tarantino is not very good movies that were forced to be finished. Kind of like bad sequels, where the motivation is like, well, it needs to do better than the previous movie. Not we need to make a better movie even, or make a good movie, or even just make a movie we can all feel good about. Instead, it's like, nah, this movie needs to be even bigger. And you know, like the third sequel to any movie is so completely over the top and ridiculous that it's never good. Like, even if it's animated, like Madagascar 3 is the dumbest shit on the planet. And the first 2 movies are great, because the third movie is like, we gotta make it bigger and all this stuff, instead of like, we have to make it quality, let's say. So, my theory would be that if he pushed through, motivation would start to wane, because there would be this constant battle of trying to live up to I feel like doing this other thing, but I'm writing the Inglourious Bastards prequel, so I gotta do that. You don't lose motivation when you're excited to do your work. Motivation is a sign that you're, like not having it is a sign that your process is broken. You're doing the wrong thing at that time if you're not motivated to do it. In general, part two, if you have a problem with consistency, you start projects and for a little while everything flows nicely, and then you become apathetic. Could argue this is slightly different than motivation. You could be super into the idea-making part of work. I love the idea-making part of work. I like graphic design too, but not as much as I like coming up with the ideas for what the graphic design is about. I know last week I showed some stuff where I didn't physically design the thing. I designed it and then I researched it, sketched it, and developed ideas, and then showed them to a client. And once the client saw it, I handed it off to someone else and said, go do this. No sleep lost by me for not being the one clicking around in Illustrator. There's nothing fun about clicking around in Illustrator. When I work by myself completely, I totally run into this problem. I don't want to do the tweaky stuff at the end. I don't want to double check the files before they go to the printer. I don't want to pick color. I want to be like blue and red and just kind of get it right. I do not want to sit there with a Pantone book looking at 100 blues, trying to find the perfect blue. All that stuff bores me, and that's when I really procrastinate. I also never get paid because I find invoicing unbelievably boring. I don't invoice basically until my wife is flipping out that we can't pay the rent, and I'm like, I guess I'll send out that invoice, and it takes 30 seconds. But in my mind, drag, no motivation. So the one motivating thing to keep going for me is fear. Fear of getting evicted helps me invoice. Fear of getting sued by a client for not finishing up the last 5% of the project makes me finish up those last little bits of copy updates, or makes me double check that stuff is ready to go to the printer. If you do graphic design work, when you print for a client, you pay out of your pocket first. So even something small, like a little 11 by 17 two-color poster that we do for the soap factory, I gotta shell out something like $1,500 right off the bat. Not a ton of money, but it would suck if something went wrong with the printing and I had to pay another $1,500 to reprint it. So you pay for it and make sure it's good, and then you bill your client for it. So you could potentially, like every time you print something, be out anywhere from $200,000 to $80,000, depending on the scale of stuff that you're doing. If you're not thinking about, and it helps if you've made some mistakes, if this goes wrong because I didn't double check, like I didn't spell check it, or I didn't double check the color, or I didn't do the drawdowns, that's like one I've been guilty of, I'm on the line for money I barely have. Like a lot of times little art gallery stuff, it's like whatever, you're getting paid $500, $800 to design this thing, and then before you even get paid, you're gonna shell out $1,500 just to print it. So the printing costs more than what you're getting paid for the design. So if you screw it up, it's not just losing money, you're literally in debt now from not checking the file, not double checking the color, not making sure the images are high res enough, any number of things. So if let's say you're gonna go into self-publishing, I mean, that's a really good way to learn how to not make mistakes. Because you print something, and the first thing you print, and it costs you $6,000 to print your comic, and then you screwed it up, and all of a sudden you're in so much trouble because maybe you shell out the $6,000 because you screwed it up, and you have to pay for your mistakes, but then you can't actually do anything with the comics, and you got to wait and save up another $6,000 to do another run. So I have to use fear for that part of it. If I'm bored, I need fear. Motivation in general just comes from if I follow my process, I'm always motivated. It's the bullshit boring stuff that I'm just too self-centered and ADD to get through a lot of that stuff. So fear is a really good one for the boring stuff that has to get done. The boring stuff that doesn't have to get done, don't do it. It's super easy. How often did you find yourself stuck where you had an idea but weren't sure on how to execute it? And if so, what did you do to overcome that? So I think I talked about when I worked at Intermedia Arts, I'd get creative block all the time. got that creative block because I was constantly attached to this outcome. I'd get like an assignment, like design a poster for this series of hip hop workshops. So it was like a nonprofit art center, and I'd be so excited. Like, this is awesome. I grew up listening to hip hop. My identity is super wrapped up in it. It needs to be good. It needs to be innovative. It needs to be interesting. It needs to be cool. Those were like the things I'd go into it with. And like, no surprise, I would have the worst creative block in the world. All day long, I would struggle to make something, and I could never commit to it because I'd be like, this doesn't really seem good. This doesn't really seem new. This doesn't really seem innovative. I did the dumb thing where people tell you to go for a walk when you have creative block, which is the stupidest, worst advice anyone can ever give you. I went for walks all day long, constant walks, and none of my creative block magically lifted from looking at flowers. Go figure. I went to the museum. Weird, looking at other awesome, amazing stuff that intimidated me didn't make me do great work. Bizarre. What usually it did was having to be like, fuck, I'm out of time. I need to make something. And at that point, good, innovative, quality, cool, all that stuff had to fall by the wayside because I'm about to get fired if I don't make something. That was usually where my breakthroughs on a project would come through. But I never did anything great from doing that. Like doing something at 2 a.m. before it's due is almost never going to lead to good work. It's at least going to lead to work. But if I had gone into it and thought more about ideas like, what do I want to convey? What kind of emotion do I want the reader to have that sees this poster? Like, do I want them to be excited? How can I try to communicate something very specifically instead of constantly be attached to this needs to be awesome? Because this needs to be awesome is just the worst thing you could do for yourself. Assume it's going to be awesome because you made it. That's the way to actually kind of get rid of that. So I would have ideas and I couldn't execute them, and the problem was because I had an exact picture in my head. So let's say you have an exact picture in your head of something that you need to do, and you need to draw the concept, and you're like me, and you coasted through drawing classes getting C's because you actually don't like drawing in any way, shape, or form. You're kind of screwed if all of a sudden the concept requires a drawing. I didn't learn how to think abstractly and say, I want to convey process, let's say. What are all the ways I could convey process and make a nice big list? I would say, I want to convey process. I should make a drawing of, what can I make a drawing of? A breakdancer in all these diagrammatic positions running through the poster. I'm a terrible photographer, so I wouldn't have been able to photograph it, and I wouldn't have had time to get someone to do it, and then I cannot draw to save my life, so I can't do that either. But I'd get super attached to that, and I might be sitting in like Google Images trying to find images, and then scanning and drawing in Illustrator, and just doing this bullshit instead of being like, if the idea is about process, what is every way you can communicate process? Do the ones that you have the skill set to do. But instead, I was like, this has to be great, it has to be innovative, it has to be cool. And as such, I failed miserably time and time again. Now, if I had that same thing, it's not so much that I would try to have an idea on how to execute it, but I might come up with an idea, and then I will brainstorm every possible way to execute it. And then I'll look for the ones where there's an overlap between my skill set, my resources, like do I have time to hire someone to make the piece of this I need? Or do I have a friend who can do these watercolor washes or whatever it is? And then time. Like, do I have the time and do I have the budget to have this person do the thing I need? But in the past, I would have been like, I'll do it. Yeah, the day before it's due, I'll learn how to do watercolor. That will go super well. Okay, here's a good one. I've been drumming up an original fantasy world and I want to create a story or comic about it. Is there anything imperative that I need to know about creating something basically completely original from any standpoint, comic or not? Like, how do I lay out this world for other people to understand with the least amount of confusion possible? It is mildly complex just because I came up with such extraneous information, including numerous countries I probably won't be using, and so forth. So, on the one hand, this is cool. It's all research for a story or for some kind of massive world. The danger, though, is probably this line. Creating something basically completely original. It attaches a value judgment to the thing that you're trying to do, and that can lock you up, because that's already a way to give yourself creative block. maybe you have to do a ton of shit that's not original in order to get there. Or maybe you need to start really small. Like, I've been watching The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is interesting because it starts out claustrophobic and it expands season by season. You see more and more of the world they inhabit, and it becomes ever more of a nightmare. It's bigger and bigger, massive worldwide nightmare. But in the beginning, it starts out like what? One dude wakes up in Atlanta. What is going on? And then he goes somewhere else. Then they travel. Shit still sucks, but now we see a little bit more of the world. Then they go here. Oh, we find out there's other survivors, and you want to avoid them at all costs. And like each season, that world expands and gets bigger. Now, I don't know that they came up with that entire world. My intuition would be they started with chunks of it and were probably vaguely thinking about it, but when it came time to think about the, like, whatever, terminus, the sanctuary, that probably was a ways down the road of thinking, okay, what if there was a place to be safe, and what if it turned out to not be safe? So it's like they had to actually write to get there. That's kind of my assumption. So we have this big, massive world. I think there's kind of two things you could do. You could go Stanley Kubrick route, develop that whole massive world, and maybe the thing never comes to life, but you have that amazing Napoleon book about the movie that was never made. Or start somewhere with a story. Expect it not to be good, but expect to learn things about it, and then write another story. And instead of being concerned about, okay, I'm going to make this epic world, start with small things that are inside of it and gradually expand and figure out who are your characters, what do they want to do? Do they even go to these other countries? Do these other countries matter? But basically, if you want to write something, start writing ASAP and write the kind of story you want to write. Because even creating a world, Walking Dead could easily be a comedy. Super easily. All the zombies are hilarious. They find it super hard to kill you. Every once in a while, they bite you, and it's totally your fault if they bite you, because only a moron could not get bit by these zombies. And then they encounter somebody like the governor, and he's hilarious, wisecracking. He doesn't even need the eye patch. He's got both eyes. Like, it could very easily be a comedy. It could turn into, like, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where it's just about the day-to-day hijinks of living behind the walls with all the zombies outside and occasionally having to go conduct adventures. It's obviously not that, right? It's instead this, like, drama that's brutally violent and makes you contemplate the role of violence in humanity, but it could just as easily be something else in the exact same sets, the exact same world. You have to start somewhere and start actually writing the story, because the story is going to end up starting to form the world around it. And so I'm reading this, and I'm pretty sure that what we're thinking about is this really cool, interesting world, but we got to start thinking about, like, okay, who's in this world and what are they doing? Because that's actually going to help us understand it. Like, if I'm trying to think of another example. I feel like the Walking Dead example is really good. The zombies, like, if what happens is when you become a zombie, all your teeth fall out, and you can't actually bite someone, hilariousness. Constant close calls with gummy zombie mouths trying to rip you apart, and they can't. They wouldn't even need to kill them. They would just be a minor nuisance. Like, a really little twist dramatically changes it, and you could have, again, the exact same world, or it could be the zombies are a nuisance to the people, incredibly dangerous. So there's any number of ways for that to go. I thought Walking Dead this whole time was a horror thing. It was my assumption. I was like, oh, God, more zombies. And my wife started watching it, and I was like, whoa, this show is dope. It's not what I thought it was. Start writing the story. Get into the actual story, because that's going to shape the world that is happening, and it's going to change the concerns from this is this part of the world, and there's this, and maybe there's a planet, and this is the weather. It's going to turn into, they've done this, what happens next? The Wire is another good example of that. If you've ever seen The Wire, basically starts out in a couple blocks, and it expands and covers up more and more of Baltimore. They talked about if they kept doing more seasons, that world would just get bigger and bigger and bigger until it would start to encompass national politics. The answer to almost anything is always start at the stupidest, simplest thing you can do.